So good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to the first Pharma Future Congress in Dubai. And I hope this is just the starting point, and every year this becomes one of the most engaging platforms to learn and exchange thoughts. So I'm not the first speaker, so I've got the easiest task of starting and giving it to the others to carry it forward. So, but I'm really thankful for setting this up. There have been a lot of support from the Pharma team members here who have helped us to put this together. And I really appreciate on a weekend, you all have made it here. So hopefully next 3 hours could be good exchange of ideas, and we could learn from here and move forward. I know emerging markets is being looked up as the area for growth for every company. Go lesser than 20% growth, and CEOs come back and say this is not what expected from you. So I think we've got the toughest challenge of keeping that alive, and then they come back and tell us you don't have the most abundant resources also. So it's more for less, and in those struggling times we got to get the best out of us. So I think there is a whole lot of effort which has to go to see what we can kind of look at for next 5 to 7 years. And as we all know, pharma is going to be a very different playing field in next 4 to 5 years. So I'm going to turn it on to the first speaker, Bob. Bob is going to, I'm going to leave it to him to introduce himself. But clearly, what he's going to spend time in telling us what Western pharma, how they worked for 30 years, and what kind of challenges they saw and some of the big mistakes maybe they did, so that they can help us to kind of see that we can maybe shorten that learning curve and kind of take some different steps to kind of tackle the same problems. So welcome Bob to in Dubai. He's been extremely happy, first visit, and we had a great evening dinner last night, and he said, I want to come back again and again, so don't take me out of the next year's list of speakers. Already, he's been smart enough to fix a golf game and an invitation with some of the other folks here. So Bob, you're coming next year, don't worry. Welcome.
Wow, that was a relief. I was hoping I'd get back, so thanks, Garv. And it's really great to be here. I was very amazed when I landed yesterday and saw, I guess, which is now the second tallest building in the world. I couldn't quite see the top. It's the tallest still? I couldn't quite see the top because of the haze, but hopefully I'll get back sometime when it's not quite so hazy and warm to see things. So just to give you a little bit about my background, after graduate school, I got an MBA at Kellogg in Chicago, and I joined Merck as a sales representative. So I actually carried a bag for 5 years as a sales rep with MSD in the US. Spent the next 18 years in headquarters marketing, at which time I got the opportunity to launch 7 new products, which were significant brands. The largest was Fosamax, so I did the whole North American launch of Fosamax from a marketing perspective. I had the opportunity to start the Merck Vaccine division with a physician colleague of mine, which we took as a global division and is still doing quite well. A little over 10 years ago, I left Merck and went to a major wholesaler in the US called McKesson. I built a services business for them in pharma, and then for the past 8 years have been involved with Indegene in helping build out a global delivery services business for medical education, marketing, and intelligence, which we actually merged our US group into about 6 years ago. So I'm happy to be here. I've been through the days at Merck of you need to grow the bottom line by 20% each year without new resources. I've been in the areas of lack of physician access, lack of effective ways to communicate. So hopefully what I'm going to focus on today really is, what happened back about 10 or 12 years ago in the US, and how did that relate to what the US is facing today, and to some degree Western Europe. And what lessons might we learn from that in emerging markets such as Middle East or India or China or any other emerging country. So 10 years ago, believe it or not, physicians still had a significant impact on the prescription choice in the U.S. Even though managed care was having a direct influence in decreasing actually the time that prescribers had either seeing a representative or seeing a patient. As managed care began to influence the writing of prescriptions and the usage of healthcare resources in the U.S., they started by really establishing formularies. And they did that effectively by putting tier pricing in so that if you had a higher priced product, you would be at a higher tier and it would be more difficult for a physician to use your product. So the patient would either have to pay a higher copay or have previously been on one of the lower tiered products before they could get up to the next tier. Another thing that really came into play was this whole area of direct-to-consumer advertising, and also through the web. WebMD and Medscape were becoming, more of a prevalent feature back in the early 2000s and late 1999s. The product pipelines of most of the major companies were pretty robust. And that's a lot different than it is today. A lot of the products have failed, as you know, in phase 3. And the patent cliff of major products wasn't really affecting the way we did business 10 or 12 years ago in the US. And so if you look at the kind of the spectrum of ways that pharma companies in the US would communicate with physicians, it was still mostly a push mentality. So heavy influence with rep detailing, rep consulting or dinner meetings, call centers, and then traditional flat advertising. So journal ad spending, direct mail, and really not a lot into the pull area, which you'll see a lot more frequently now, such as a lot of online communications. Areas where, at least in the US, a doc can go in on a website and find out just about everything he or she needs to know about a product or a therapeutic option. If you look at the budgets that I was looking at, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, sales reps in the US and MSLs or medical specialists, whatever the company's called, was about a $10 billion expenditure for the companies. Sales support, mainly the biggest one was sampling. There's about $4.5 billion spent in samples and detail aids, 10 years ago. Direct-to-consumer advertising was about $3 billion, but growing, and a very small portion of that was in this whole e-media area. Most of it was spent in, regular flat journal advertising and direct mail. And then a big and growing thing before regulations came in were what we called dinner meetings. And that was when you could get a group of physicians together for dinner, take them to a nice restaurant, pay them $50 and have them listen to a speaker or watch a movie or listen to a rep, and they'd all go away happy. And we actually monitored the results. So you could take IMS prescription data, look at their data trends, their prescribing trends 3 months before the dinner meeting, look at it 3 months after the dinner meeting, come up with an ROI, and wonderful enough, it was ROI positive to a significant degree. Now, things have changed recently, and they've probably changed around the world in that you can't really do this anymore. Certainly can't pay physicians to go to dinner meetings. But to some degree, some companies are still, trying to do these, even in the US. If you looked at what was the kind of the nuclear arms race for reps in the US, when I started with Merck in 1974, our total sales force in the US was 274 people. And if you look at that now, I don't know what Merck's current numbers are because they've come down, but it seems like the industry peaked in about 2005, 2006, with about 100,000 representatives in the US. And if you look at IMS prescribing, there's about 100,000 docs that really write 85% of the prescriptions. So there's almost a 1-to-1 ratio of pharmaceutical reps to productive doctors in the US. So you can kind of see, an issue of access coming. And you almost look at it, if you've ever seen that movie with George Clooney, The Perfect Storm, where all these forces come together, that kind of began to hit in the early to mid-2000s in the US. First issue that came to play is the number of new drugs that were approved by FDA. Kind of peaked in 2004 and has since gone down. I think if you look at 2009 and 10 numbers of NCEs that are approved, it's actually below 2008. So even though, the pipelines in the early 2000s were still full of products, for some reason they weren't making it through FDA at the speed that they had in prior years. One key factor that I think shook up the industry more than anything else was when Merck had to withdraw Vioxx off the market. And immediately $2.5 billion worth of sales went away. But more importantly, it put the FDA on high alert for other products that were either in the pipeline or other products that might have had some questionable safety issues in the past. And then you also saw in the coming years, major product patent expirations, which obviously you have all gone through since then, not just in US, but in overseas markets, and have had a significant effect on the way that we can go on marketing and spending new products. What also happened was, the decision makers and the customers in the US were changing. So a lot of companies went to what were called kind of physician office teams or account teams or whatever, where they'd have a series of 2 or 3 representatives calling on not just the physician, but also the nurses and the PAs and the administrators in the office, calling on any hospital contacts that that office had, to try and treat them as a client, as an overall client. And to some degree that worked, and to other degrees it didn't. The payers in the healthcare system in the US were becoming much more important. About 50% of the overall healthcare budget in the US is now paid for by the federal or state government, either through Medicare or Medicaid programs. But of the private business, that was becoming even more closely managed by big insurance companies like Aetna, big HMOs, and really putting cost pressures and strains on not only the ability to get your products on their formulary, but also in access to their physician populations. So that, for example, in Kaiser Permanente in California, you have virtually no access to most of the primary care physicians in there. You can make appointments, but they're at a very, very low frequency. So you have to figure out different ways other than personal promotion to communicate to that type of an audience. And then we saw this rising pressure coming from patients. The pharmaceutical companies have been doing a lot of direct-to-consumer advertising on television. Even today, you can't turn on the evening nightly news without seeing at least 3 pharmaceutical commercials. So patients are starting to ask their pharmacists, their doctors, what about this new therapy? And as the time that the doctor has available to spend with a patient keeps going down, the doctor would just give them anything really they wanted to keep them as a patient. So there was a lot of this patient demand type marketing going on within the US. Another thing that came into play, and many of you experienced this firsthand, was there's kind of this new era of mega deals. So you had, Merck Shearing, Wyeth, Pfizer, the whole Pharmacia, Upjohn, Novartis, everybody was coming together because in a public company situation, it kind of allows you off the hook from a growth perspective and EPS with shareholders, because it kind of mixes things up. You can say, well, we're going to rationalize expenses for 2 or 3 years and don't worry so much on the pipeline. And so that's probably going to continue. I would imagine, and most of the analysts in the US will say that over the next 10 years, you'll probably see 3, maybe 4 more major consolidations like that. The other thing we are beginning to see now is more attention by marketers on the new media. And the real question in this is which of the new media are going to win out. And nobody really knows right now, so they're placing their bets in many, many different places. There's a lot of product disease websites. In fact, some companies, major companies, will have 10 or 12 different product disease websites, and then they'll modify those for each of the major countries that have internet accessibility. So there's really not been a lot of coordination in this over the years. And obviously, sales forces have continued to decrease in size, so that right now, where there are probably around 75,000 reps in the U.S., that's projected to go down to about 70,000 over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. The other thing you can see in the chart on the left is that overall, the estimated industry costs show about a 20% decline in the sales and marketing spend. This is in addition to the cost of field representatives. Now, probably a good bit of that is coming from alternatives to actual samples that have been used in the office. So couponing programs are very typical in the U.S. right now. Taking money off of a patient's copay for a medication is a very attractive option. And we're really gone from the days where the representative, in my days, Merck would send me so many samples, I had to, almost rent a garage to keep all the samples for a month or so. I think that's come down dramatically over the course of the last few years. But overall, even with these declines in promotional resources, operating margins, have peaked a few years ago and are continuing to decline, at least in the U.S. and probably in most of the Western Europe markets. So that's why the pressure's probably on all of you guys to grow at 20 or 30% along with China and India and everything to make up for this lack of growth and growth in operating income for the Western divisions of these companies. In the U.S., access to physicians is continuing to decline. If you see now, there's only about a third of physicians that are fully accessible, where clearly a third are either restricted or no see at all. So the key thing there is, of the bottom third even, how do you get to them from a new technology standpoint, from some standpoint other than actually going into the office and seeing them? And you can see that over the years, companies have modified somewhat how they're spending their resources. But the interesting thing is, as they look at this overall new commercial model, and I'm not going to go through all this specifically, we can have copies of the slides when we're done, they haven't really effectively adapted to who the new influencers are, who the new stakeholders are, and appropriately kind of put their resources towards them. This is a study that was done by McKinsey a few years back, and I don't know whether you can really read it all that well, but the point here is that really there isn't an alignment currently of commercial resources with stakeholder influence, where years ago when the physician had 90% of the influence over a prescription, and we as companies were focusing 100% of our resources towards the physician, then that was appropriate. Today, as you look at it, the provider actually has a much smaller say in the overall prescribing of what brand or what therapy gets prescribed. And we still yet spend our money mostly on resources to support physicians, PAs, and other typical or more typical prescription writers. So what are the implications of some of this? Well, if you talk to the experts, and I'm certainly not an expert, but I've done a lot of reading on this, suggestions are that companies really need to optimize across the communication mix, determining, what's appropriate for each customer segment and what's appropriate for each drug type, and how does that fit into the life cycle of the product. Really taking into consideration a lot of things about that therapeutic decision. What is the patient like? Are they going to be compliant? What technology do we have available? What audience do we have to reach that patient through? What's the return on investment? I don't see a lot of companies in the U.S. doing ROI analyses anymore. And there are lots of excuses about the reason why they can't do it. but you just don't see the rigor that was applied back in the late 90s and the early 2000s to the way promotional money is spent. I spoke to a product director of a major company not too long ago, and they have a major brand that was launched about a year and a half ago and has flattened out. And the question I had to him is there anything that we as Indegene can do to help you? And he said, well, listen, I have 220 ongoing promotion programs against this brand. I don't need 221, but if you can help me figure out which one of the 220 is working or not, that would be very beneficial. So the message I heard was we're just scattergunning, doing as many things as we can to either try and pull us out of the trench and get us growing again, or even during a launch period, putting as many resources everywhere to try and hit that launch curve growth that management expects. So what does the road look like ahead? Well, I think a lot of the old forces are going to continue. Products are going to continue to go off patent. Most recently, Lipitor was a new example of how you can maintain some semblance of share for a period of 6 months by very effectively working with, in this case, payers in the US to help maintain share. But there's a lot of other products that probably aren't going to see that happen in their companies, and you'll see the typical curve that goes off, at least in the US, to about 15% brand share after 3 months, and then going down to just below 10% after 6 months. So in some markets, branded products are valued. In the US, consumers have been conditioned to believe that generics are every bit as equivalent and as effective as brand name products. And the most trusted resource, healthcare resource in the US, is actually the pharmacist. So the pharmacist has been the chief purveyor of this message to older individuals who are on fixed incomes or have significant copays in their healthcare plan. I think we went over the fact that drug companies are going to continue to decrease sales forces. And, this in-between between decreasing your own sales force and not having enough share of voice out there has been the resurgence of contract sales organizations. So a lot of companies in the US they'll decrease their sales force size maybe by 500 reps, but then they'll have 250 or 300 reps in a contract detailing force, either on an exclusive basis or a shared basis with another brand. Regulatory scrutiny in the US just continues to increase. As the Obama healthcare reform comes into play next year, if it comes into play, that will even increase scrutiny more because pricing will now come into consideration. And so we'll go back to the days 20 years ago when we actually have congressional pricing hearings on drugs, which probably isn't going to be all that pleasant to help industry growth. And certainly there'll be further consolidation. On the patient side, with better education, there's certainly going to be more participation in the healthcare decision by patients. Healthcare reform is not only going to affect the government spenders, but also will spill over into the private sector, so that insurance companies are going to take the leads of what the federal government does with respect to pricing on either government formularies or tenders. And I think that the bottom result is that physicians and caregivers who are willing to give access to pharmaceutical companies in the form of either seeing a rep, listening to a teledetail or an e-detail, are going to demand more value out of that interaction. And what can you bring to me other than just a product message in the overall equation? So this really is going to be the new commercial model. How do you add value going forward? And I'm sure that's pretty consistent around the world. So 5 imperatives that I think are probably important in this new commercial model are really to, since I'm an old marketer, to really recenter this whole marketing equation on value creation. And we've talked about that in the US for many, many years, and we've really never really defined it that well. And I think the reason why we haven't defined it is we haven't spent enough time figuring out or asking our customers, what is of value to them? You know, what are they not getting that they really need to better treat a patient, to get a better outcome, to understand that outcome, and to be able to tell that patient what outcome is expected so that they can comply to the therapy. Next, I think this new model takes a multi-stakeholder approach. Can't just deal with one individual anymore. Almost you have to map out, you know, what is the stakeholder influence in each therapeutic area, for each product, for each country, for each market, and figure out where along the patient's journey with the first prescription, the follow-up prescription, the lab test, the hospitalization, how that equation all fits together, and how you can be visible at all those touch points along the journey. I think if you incorporate this idea of value creation earlier into the development of products, it'll be very, very valuable. In a minute, Waleed's going to talk about, you know, the importance of how many Middle Eastern countries are going to start requiring local studies to have products either put on formulary or approved. I think it's important as you think and your scientists think about how they're going to design these local studies that there's clear value creation captured in there. Whether it's outcomes-based, whether it's compliance-based, you know, how do you figure out how you can win versus just typically what a Western label would look like. And then really to think of your own areas, which communication tools are going to be winners 5 years from now in your market, and start investing in them now. Don't wait until they hit you, but look at them now, do some assessments of them now, and start investing in them now. And then again, you know, rigorously look to measure ROI. There are lots of data sources. What we don't tend to, or we hadn't in the Western markets tend to do, is effectively utilize them. We're so eager to get a program out that we forget to really say, okay, let's do a baseline measurement, let's put some measurement in place during the program, and let's measure afterwards to make sure it was effective. That's the only way, in my mind, that you're going to get the types of resources that you need going forward from management to really make your case. About a year ago, IMS did a survey of U.S. pharmaceutical executives. And one of the questions they asked was, in this whole new commercial model journey, where do you think your company is? And clearly, if you see, you can't probably read that, but in the first 3 bars there that are circled, a little over half, you know, really weren't doing that much. They either recognized that they had this need, but they really weren't underway. And I was at an Accenture presentation a couple weeks ago. As you know, Accenture is a multinational consulting company that deals with a lot of industries, not just the pharmaceutical industry. And the speaker from Accenture said that the pharma industry is like the dinosaur of big industries in adopting the new changing global model, whether it's technology, whether it's marketing, whatever, because they're so set in their ways. And that's the first time I really heard that, but it kind of rang true as I looked at these survey results that we're probably, you know, from a research and discovery standpoint, we've always been the best. And I don't think anybody can duplicate what our companies have done over the years in coming up with new drugs, new medicines, new technologies to make life better for patients. But as far as getting the message to the right prescriber, getting the message to the patient, if patients really understood the science and the mechanisms and stuff behind the drugs that we make, then you wouldn't think compliance and adherence would be such a big issue. And I can tell you in the US, 50% of patients that start on a chronic care medication are not on that medication 6 months later. And yet all of the internet technology, all of the direct-to-consumer technology, and everything that's been available in the US for years and years haven't affected that important point on the equation. So really, you know, I think the goal really is to reorient this whole marketing model to much more of a holistic view of disease, patient, and stakeholder needs and outcomes, and then really position our companies as being not only fully engaged but effective leaders in this cost-effective, patient-centered healthcare system. Now, that's a nice, lofty goal, and you can each think about what that means in your individual markets. But to me, it really means a fundamental change in the way that we're doing business today. And I think that'll happen. I think it will have to happen. You know, we did a recent survey a couple of years ago. How do you prefer to receive information regarding new drugs in the U.S.? And interestingly enough, with all the new media available in the U.S., primary care physicians still like to see journal ads. You wouldn't think that, but they still like to get that first bit of information on a new product from a journal ad. But underneath that, you can see all the digital influences that are coming. And interestingly enough, you know, sales reps are only about a fifth of the equation there, as they really prefer. It doesn't say they prefer to get information on a new drug. I think, you know, I've covered most of this, but I think the interesting thing here in the second bullet is, you know, within the next 3 years, half of the growth in our industry will come from E7 countries. And we were in China recently, and there was a statement made that the Chinese pharmaceutical market by the year 2020 will be 200 billion euro. And it'll be between a 30 and a 35% annualized growth rate as medicine shifts from Eastern medicine to Western medicine. And you typically hear that, you know, in a lot of emerging markets. So the burden is really going to be on you all to maintain at least the stability or the growth of the mothership that's either back in Europe or in US. I think as you see, you know, the physician's decision, prescribing, you know, this is just the point of this really is that the prescribing decisions, you know, are changing over the course of the product life cycle. So that early on, you know, physicians come from a more emotional, you know, relationship-based, you know, pre-launch type of prescribing decision to, you know, post-launch more of a rational and fact-based approach. So the real message here is, as I get through that first step of, you know, I need to figure out how to prescribe this new therapy, you know, within the third or fourth year, it's, I know everything about this drug. I know more than you, Mr. or Mrs. Sales Rep, and just let me be and let me keep prescribing. So I think a lot will change. I think that the emerging markets are going to be certainly a key influence and a key importance in the growth of our overall industry. And I hope to be able to dialogue with you later on as we break after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, so much. Bob, we would like you to stay here for a couple of minutes. We want to present you a small memento. Sridhar, I'll invite you to present a small memento to Bob. I think thank you so much for a fairly insightful meeting and setting the context for us to learn from the Western world.